Hey friends, I'm Maxwell Freud, a queer Minneapolis-based game designer and the host of Hatch This Way, a limited audio series where I chat with other queer folks in the tabletop industry to learn all about who they are and how they contribute to the hobby by being their authentic selves. And today I am chatting with Crystal Dax. Crystal, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm so happy to be here. I'm really looking forward to getting to chat with you.
Oh my gosh, I cannot wait to meet you. So, very important question. How do you identify? What are all the words that make up who Crystal Dax is?
Absolutely. So my pronouns are she, her. I identify as a woman and always have. And I identify as bisexual. And the way I define bisexual is that I am both sexually and romantically attracted to people of my gender and other genders. So basically, pansexual would probably be an identifier that would also apply to me. But since I am an elder millennial and I didn't grow up with the term pansexual, bisexual is the one that I latched onto once I realized who I was, and that is how I have identified ever since.
Yeah, let's get into it. Talk to me a little bit about what that journey was like for you. So how do we get from your humble origins to the amazing person you are now?
It honestly wasn't a rough journey. I think I had it easier than a lot of people do. But it was a long one because I did not identify as bisexual until my mid-20s. And growing up, I grew up as a member of the Methodist Church in Missouri. And I, honest to God, do not remember in my young life knowing that bisexual people even existed. Like, there were definitely some gay people, not very many, but a handful. I had a best friend in high school named Jeremy, who I absolutely adored, who was gay. And I always found female celebrities to be attractive, but not knowing that you could be attracted to both men and women. Like, just as a young person, I didn't know that that was possible. I just always assumed, oh, okay, yeah, they're cute, but I clearly like guys, so therefore I must be straight. And I kind of grew up with that and hadn't even really questioned it for a very long time because I was like, I like men. I like dating men. That seems okay for me. And interestingly enough, right after I met my now ex-husband, when I was 25, right after I met him was when I started hanging out with people more in the queer community, in the kink community, kind of just open-minded, wonderful humans. And I realized who I truly was. But my husband and I were in a monogamous relationship. And so I didn't talk about my bisexuality openly for a while. And nobody was telling me that I couldn't talk about it, but it just felt somewhat disingenuous to me to be in a straight presenting relationship and trying to shout about my queer identity because I didn't want to take space from other queer people. And I, at that time, felt that is what I would have been doing. And as I got older, I realized that it was more important for me to talk about my identity because being in a heteronormative presenting relationship does not cancel out the fact that I am bisexual. And the representation of seeing that bisexual women can be in relationships with men and still have their identities be valid is important. And it's something that our culture has not really latched onto well enough in a lot of ways. Bisexual women tend to be treated, as either sluts or only can be polyamorous. I do happen to be polyamorous at this point in my life, but obviously bisexual women do not need to be. And so, yeah, I started making my identity more of my public presence. Especially because as I got into content creation in the tabletop space, I realized that there were very few queer content creators. And when people would call me an ally, they'd say, "Oh, Crystal, you're a great ally." For a long time, I didn't correct them before I had been talking about my identity because I was like, well, that's fine. I'm happy that they see me that way. And at a certain point, I realized, no, I should be correcting them and letting them know, I am a part of the queer community and my identity is valid. And it was especially important for me as I got more prominent placements within board game media to make sure that I was representing both as a woman and as someone in the queer community. So that is a lot of the reasons behind why I make board game content, is specifically because there was representation that was missing when I started making content. And I wanted, rather than complaining about the lack of representation, I decided to do something about it.
Hey, same. I love all of that. That's why we're doing this right now. I mean,
Yeah.
that is same mission. Yeah. So I briefly talked to another guest I had about bi erasure. So I think that's like literally what you just described. And I think we mentioned like very similar things of, would you say like the thing is with men being bi is like, it's usually like, oh, sure, bi, I think is usually the implication.
Yeah, like
And
with the air quotes around it, that
yeah,
I think a lot of, especially popular culture, does tend to treat bisexual men as, well, they're actually gay, but they're just,
yeah.
whatever. And that obviously is not okay. Everyone's journey to their identity is different, and some people will identify as different things throughout their lives as they learn and grow and understand themselves better or in different ways. But yeah, for both men and women, I think bisexuals have been, erased to some degree or scrutinized in ways that other identities aren't. And that's not to say that we have it the worst by any means. There are identities, especially trans folks, who have it so much worse. And it's funny, I've tried to specifically, as a cis white woman, I recognize that I have power and I have the ability to speak out about things that other people don't have the luxury to be able to do because of the risk that it would present to them. And so I have especially tried to really support and advocate for the trans community, because especially with the things going on in our country right now, I know we're recording this a couple months before the podcast is going to release, but I'm sure in June things will probably not be much better. And I just have to say, my Twitter feed has become exponentially more delightful the more trans people I have followed.
Absolutely. I also think it was really interesting because you're not the first person to mention how like you didn't really realize your queerness until you saw it out there. Like the representation for you wasn't, oh, that's me. It was like, oh my God, that could, like, I didn't know that was me until I saw that was me. Like, I think that's a really interesting thing that has come up. And I think maybe I'm hoping that's maybe a shift for future generations, is that there's just more representation out there so that people can see themselves like identified at a younger age, and they're like, oh, that's an option. Like,
yeah,
I was always that way, like I was always gay, but I was talking about this before. Like I watched like Clueless on repeat growing up, but I never like made this connection in my head that the Christian character was gay, because he was never like romantically with another guy. So I think they say the word gay like once, but I had no definition of what that meant because I didn't see it. And I honestly like didn't have like gay representation. So I was like, I think same boat. I didn't really know. And then you like see someone, you're like, oh my God, you just know, like we know. So
yes,
my point was, I don't think it's, for anyone listening, it's not turning people queer. Like representation doesn't make people queer, but it might help us realize that part of ourselves that like we never acknowledged or didn't know, or like we're afraid to talk about. Like it's not making it, like it's not planting the seed, it's uncovering it, I think is what I would
absolutely
stress to people.
Yeah, like when I try and think of popular culture from, like I was born in 1984, and trying to think of like late 80s or 90s TV shows or movies, like generally you did see gay and lesbian characters in some things, but they were very often pure stereotypes. My dog just tried to jump on my lap. Do you want to come up here on my lap? Come here. You want to come say hi? Oh my gosh. The gay and lesbian characters that you saw on television were often portraying the most classic stereotypes that you could imagine. And there were some shows who were getting parts of it right. I think the sitcom Friends is a good example of a show that both did things horribly wrong and sometimes right. And so, like that shift in media has definitely, it started around that time, but I don't think it's still, representation in popular culture is still not where it should be, but it's getting better. And but yeah, like if you're a young person and you do not see what you are represented in any of the things you consume on a daily basis, and no one has told you that this thing exists, how would you ever know? So, especially for people who grow up in, rural areas or more secluded communities, or have their access to specific types of media limited, because of religion or upbringing or whatever else, there's a lot of people who just aren't seeing themselves, and therefore likely their journey will take longer, or they will feel afraid to start their own journey because of what they perceive to be normal, not actually being normal for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, and I know from personal connections, like it can also be extremely toxic way to live your life, and you might not ever get the chance to be your authentic self. I mean, I have people in my life who came out very late and just never felt they had like the permission or freedom to express themselves truly. And it's really hard. They went through people are suicidal, they're alcoholic, it just brings on a lot of struggle that like hiding of yourself. That's how you cope with it. Like you have to come up with some way to cope with that, like
Right.
that, like I guess hating yourself in a way, or like being ashamed of like just literally who you are.
Yeah, when especially, when family members or friends or other people in your community are clearly and vocally not supportive of the things that you believe yourself to be, that directly affects your self-worth immediately. And it also can cause a lot of harm going forward, because you not being able to live as yourself will fundamentally change people and how they perceive the world and how they interact with it, often to the detriment of the world, because when people are allowed to be their full selves, they shine and they can do amazing things. And when they're trying to hold themselves back, I believe it affects more aspects of their life than just their, sexual or romantic identity. And so, and I think, honestly, that kind of goes back to the popular culture thing. I think as representation behind the scenes of popular culture has improved, the quality of the content that we've gotten, whether we're talking about movies, TV shows, or even tabletop board games, cool new things have started to come around because more diverse people are making those things. And so then the representation gets better, which makes other people feel more comfortable, which makes them get into more the creation of the things, and the cycle just spins up and gets better and better. And I will admit, I at times am frustrated by how slow that that cycle tends to run. But it's running and it's getting better. And I try and see how far we've come, even just in my own lifetime. And I am hopeful, looking at Gen Z especially. Like I'm a millennial who loves Gen Z. Bring them on, let them take control of everything. We can't buy houses, we millennials. I mean, I have a house, I'm lucky, but like we'll let Gen Z just do whatever they want, honestly.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think they're ready. I worked in schools for a number of years, and there's a lot of hope in schools. I think that's always been the case, but like it was really great to go in and feel like there's very visibly a lot of initiatives being taken in schools. And I worked in pretty much every school in the state of Minnesota that to make children feel safe and welcomed. And like, I think that is not something I experienced growing up. We had Gay Straight Alliance that started.
Yeah, we had the same. And what's interesting is I wasn't even part of that when I was in high school.
I wasn't either, because I wasn't out. And also the teacher who started it got let go shortly after. So like my district actively made strides to like make the district less inclusive. It's a problem.
Yeah.
I think I also wanted to mention, I had forgot, but I think for me, you mentioned the people in your life affecting you. I think like I was never really like I don't remember people like in school or people my age like bullying me, and like I don't think I tried to hide myself because of the people my age around me bullying me or like treating me differently. I think it was more so the influence of those like people in church and my parents and my family. Those were the voices that I heard that were giving me pressure to like lock those parts of myself away and like present very differently. I think I would have been fine if had it been like outside my family, but the fact that it was like internal voices, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally that I heard giving me, saying things like very clear indications that being gay was wrong or unnatural. I think that was a more of an influence on my life than, you know, it wasn't bullies. It was family.
Right. Yeah. Because, I mean, as countless studies have shown, kids learn that type of behavior. They don't come by it naturally. And so it really matters, you know, where you grow up and what kind of environment you're around and what your family is like as to how your experience goes as a queer person, which is why, especially because there are a lot of families who are unsupportive of their queer kids, it's more important than ever that the community help step up and assist kids when they need it. It's one of the reasons, like, I've done a lot of fundraising when I've done Twitch streams for the Trevor Project. I love the work that they do, and I think it's really important. And so, you know, just little things like that, just having those resources available can make such a huge difference in a young person's life. So
did you like come out to your family at some point?
So yes, I sometime after I was 25, I don't remember how long, I specifically came out to my sister first, and my sister is awesome. She and I are very close in age. She's less than 2 years younger than I am. And she was fully supportive and thought it was awesome. I then told my mom, and she was confused, I think, because I was with my ex-husband at the time. And I don't think she didn't say anything bad, but she also didn't fully understand or appreciate what it meant, I think. And then I don't know who ended up telling my father. He and I have not had a good relationship for a majority of my life. There have been times where I have tried to fix things to some degree. And I realized at a certain point that there were, you know, things that couldn't be fixed. And in particular, over the past few years, he has become more vocal about his animosity toward certain groups of people, and the LGBTQ community is one of those targets for him. He will post things publicly on Facebook, you know, the old trope that he'll post things like LGBTQIA LMNOP, are they going to steal the whole alphabet? You know, that kind of stuff. And he knows that he has a queer daughter, and he posts those things anyway. And so that, you know, that basically is a signal to me that I should not be wasting my time with someone who does not love and support me. So he was told at some point by somebody, and I don't know who that was because I wasn't the one that told him, but he doesn't really matter all that much. So the rest of my family is supportive. In fact, last summer, when I finally I started dating again post-divorce, and I ended up dating a couple for the first time. My mom was the biggest fan and supporter. She was so excited that I was dating a couple, that I was dating a woman, and she wanted to come to Vegas and make us spaghetti. That's what, like, my mom was like, "Can I make them my spaghetti?" And I was like, "Yes, Mom, you can come to Vegas and make us spaghetti." Of course, like, that's just weird mom stuff, right? But she was very, very supportive, like, right from the get-go. And, you know, she has really, I don't think she was ever hateful toward the LGBTQ community, but growing up in the church, I think, you know, she had a perception of what being gay meant. And I think I have helped open her eyes to the fact that what the Bible says, A, doesn't mean what most people think it does because it's been translated so many times. And B, it's not always right, even when it is translated correctly. And so she has been nothing but supportive of me since then, and it's been really wonderful. She basically tells me what I hope all parents tell their kids, which is, if you're happy, that's all that I care about. I just want you to be happy, and whoever that's with, it doesn't matter. Whether that's alone, with someone, with multiple someones, doesn't matter what their gender is, she's for it. And that's been honestly pretty delightful.
Yeah, I think, and I've been mentioning this now that I've done enough of these, where that has been the common theme for pretty much every guest so far, is that the family has more or less been supportive. I think maybe it's important for anyone listening who is queer and is like on that journey of like that more often than not. Now that is probably going to be the outcome, and it might take time, but it probably will be a positive thing in the end. Like, I think for me, like, my family's supportive, especially my siblings. They're supportive. I think my parents are similar place where they're like, if you're happy, that's all we want. I still think they kind of don't talk about like me and my brother as much. Like, I don't see posts about us and like our how we identify. Like, I think like we totally support it, but I still think there's an element of we don't want anyone to know.
Yeah.
So, I'm in a similar place as you where I think I give people as much energy as I feel they deserve, or like what I can put in without draining myself, I think is how I divvy my time up with those people in my life. Is I can give you this much time, but I'm not going to put in the extra effort if you're not going to meet me there, type thing. So,
yep. And I think that that's important because, I think most people, grow up really believing that their family is super important. And that is often very, very true. Having that close-knit support network is really powerful. But if those people aren't supporting you in the ways that they should, at a certain point, there are times when people do need to cut people out of their lives, even people that other people would say, no, you should never cut, your mom or your dad out of your life. But your own mental health is important. And if a person in your life, no matter how they are related or not related to you, if they are being detrimental to your mental health, then you owe it to yourself to do what you can to remove that from your circle, and whatever that makes sense for you. And every situation is different and every person is different. And there's a lot of times where you're not able to do that kind of thing, especially as a young person. You might be living at home with people who don't support you, and that can be incredibly taxing and disheartening and just sometimes even scary. And that's why I am glad that resources exist, like the Trevor Project. But I think as people grow older and get to know themselves more and gain that inner strength and inner power, that it's important to advocate for yourself and your mental health. And if that does mean cutting people out of your life, then sometimes that's what you have to do. And it's hard. It's really hard. Like, my dad is a huge jerk, and I still constantly doubt my decision to cut him out of my life because of society's norms and standards. And I just know that I don't deserve that type of hate in my life. I don't. And so that's what I have to keep coming back to for myself.
Yeah, and I think like a really big theme of, I think, the queer experience in general is finding, you have family and then you have like your chosen family. And I think it's especially big theme in the queer community. Like, you do really have to find the people who spark joy in your life. Like, you need to have them. I think, honestly, I would recommend it anyone just to survive. Like, you just need to find those people who truly support you wherever you're at in your journey, even if it changes. If you change how you identify later on, they need to be like, yeah, that's awesome, I'm here for you. And like, you have to find those people. Like, they're not always right there. Sometimes you have to collect them and keep them close. And
I mean, honestly, if they're listening to this podcast, I'd say they've already made a really good start, because while, like every community that exists, there are some really awful people that exist in the board game world. There are far more amazing, kind, supportive people in the board game world, both people making board games, playing board games, making content about board games. I have met some of the absolute best people through board gaming. And I don't think that that's a fluke. I think that board games specifically draw people who enjoy the camaraderie and the friendship and the socialization that the experience brings. And therefore, there are a lot of really wonderful people that just happen to be board gamers. And so, it can be tough to find them sometimes, especially depending on where you live. I know that there are a lot of really toxic board game groups that exist, both in real life and online. And so sometimes, and all it takes is one bad experience, right? Like if you walk into a game store and you are maybe somebody who looks like me, you've got wildly colored hair and you're wearing a shirt with a rainbow on it, for instance, or something like that. And you walk in and there's tables full of what appear to be white, straight, cis males, and they look at you like you don't belong. That one experience can ruin the hobby for a person. And that happens every day to people. But I think the pandemic has been good in that it has brought more people online more frequently. And I think it has hopefully allowed people to find their people a little more easily, because if they don't happen to live somewhere where really friendly and welcoming game groups exist, they can go online. I specifically host online community board game night every Tuesday evening on my Twitch channel and in my Discord. And then I also host game nights often on the weekends as well, but those aren't as regularly scheduled. And I have specifically said that I have wanted it to be a place where it is inclusive, welcoming. People, put their pronouns in their usernames, so people are aware of that. And I want people to feel like it is a place where they can belong. We try and be incredibly friendly to newcomers, and we have a lot of inside jokes that have just formed over us playing throughout the pandemic. And every time somebody comes in, if an inside joke gets referenced, I try and immediately be like, okay, wait, stop. We got to explain the story behind this, because I don't ever want people to feel like an outsider. And obviously with things like inside jokes, sometimes it can be really easy to be like, oh, I'm not part of this joke. And we try and explain, because honestly, it's fun to recount those stories. And the inside jokes that we have are somewhat ridiculous. So I don't know where I was going with that, but finding your community is important. And I think board gaming is a good start in a lot of ways.
So transitioning into board games, because we're like there, how did you get caught up in this hobby? I joke about it every time I ask this question. I'm like, it's all encompassing. It's just monetarily draining and socially, I don't know, I want to say draining, but like all encompassing. It takes up space in your home, on your shelves and floors.
Oh yeah.
So what got you into board games?
I think like a lot of people, I did play board games as a kid, not too far off the beaten path in that regard. A lot of my board games were the ones that people would be familiar with growing up, like Monopoly, Scrabble, things like that. But I also was a big fan of the electronic games that came out in the 90s, specifically things like Mall Madness and the Omega Virus, both of which I still own my original copies of, and they do still function. In fact, I'm super excited that Restoration Games is actually going to be remaking the Omega Virus, and I've talked to every employee at Restoration Games about how I would like to help in any way I can. But yeah, grew up with like those types of games. And then when I hit high school and college, I kept myself really busy with extracurriculars, just like lots and lots of activities. So gaming kind of took a backseat for me. I wasn't even really playing video games at that point, and I had grown up a Nintendo gamer. And then after college, I couldn't find work because the job market was saturated in 2007, prior to the Great Recession. And I ended up working at a casino in Kansas City for a year. And just by happenstance, got invited to one of my coworkers' houses for game night. And when I got there, I was introduced to things like Power Grid and Puerto Rico and Race for the Galaxy and Runebound and all of these delightful board games, and I just fell in love with it. And then in 2008, I ended up moving to Las Vegas, and so I lost my friend's game collection, access to that, and around 2010, I finally started building up my own collection in earnest. What's interesting is my favorite board game of all time is Battlestar Galactica, and I actually bought that game with no knowledge of what it was, simply because I had watched the Battlestar Galactica TV show and really liked it. And Borders, the bookstore that now doesn't exist anymore, was having a closeout sale, and that game was discounted on their shelf. Why Borders had Battlestar Galactica, I don't know. But I found my favorite game by happenstance, which just ended up being funny. And yeah, got into it in 2007, and it's just gotten more and more and more. My collection has grown over the years. I think I own around 450 games at this point, which to some people is a huge number. To others, it is a drop in the bucket. And it is, honestly, I've gotten to the point where I'm like, I think I own enough, and I'm still acquiring more. And I'm like, at some point, we really need to get rid of some of these games. But I'm bad at that because I have the space to keep more. And so I should live in a smaller house is all this is. So that way I have a reason to get rid of some games eventually.
I wonder how many people listening understand the the struggle that is board games.
I mean, I know of people who play games casually, who only play board games like at a casual party with friends, and they tend to defer to things like Cards Against Humanity or the other kind of more mass market party style games, and they only do that. And I can't fathom how that's possible. Because in my brain, once you go down that rabbit hole, you just want to keep digging.
There's so much, and they're so different. So what are some of you mentioned Battlestar Galactica is your favorite. So if that's your all-time favorite, what are some that you recommend to people who are getting into the hobby, dipping their toes in the water? What would you be like, oh, you got to try this?
It really, honestly, I try and tailor my recommendations specifically to some specific caveats. It's hard to generalize what the right entry-level game is for a person that I don't know, because the number of people they plan on playing with, or the ages of the people they plan on playing with, or how much time they want to spend playing a game, all can factor in. And some games that would be really good, what we call gateway games, for some people would be really horrible for others. There are some, though, that I think are good starting points for most people. One that I tend to recommend a lot is King Domino, because it has a familiarity in that most people at least are aware of dominoes as a concept, even if they've never really played actual dominoes. And just the tile laying nature of the game, it's fairly simple. The drafting is easy to approach. The rulebook isn't super long. And that game has interesting strategic depth, even though the mechanics are very simple. And so it's a game that comes off my shelf all the time as a hardcore hobby gamer, because I really enjoy the decisions that I have to make within the game. So I think King Domino is a really good one. Another one that I love, and anyone who has heard me talk anywhere ever knows that I will always recommend Strike as the game that everybody should own. It is, as one half of the Rolling Dice and Taking Names podcast would say, it's a dice in a bowl. But it is, in fact, gladiators in an arena. And every time I teach this game, I go on this big epic spiel about how we're going into gladiatorial combat and to the death. And people are like, oh, man, what is this thing? And it is literally just throwing dice into a bowl, basically. And whoever has dice left at the end, it wins the game. It's very simple, but it has those there's a mechanic in the game which if something happens, the next player has to take all of the dice in front of them and throw them all in at once. And every time that moment happens, the entire table is like, oh, like freaking out, and because that moment happens more often than what feels like should be statistically possible, every time, without fail. And I've played Strike more than any other board game I own. And it always happens in every game, and it is just a delight to watch people enjoy the silliness of it. And I think it helps shift people's mindset as to what a board game can be, because you hear board game, and that term really did used to mean a game played on a board. And I think over time, people have started adopting different language, but right now I use the term board game more generically to just mean a game played on a tabletop, because there are a lot of dexterity games and card games and games like Strike that don't involve a board at all, but I still call them board games because that's just kind of, the term has evolved to mean more than what it used to. So Strike is another good one. There's a lot of good trick-taking games, and if people grew up playing things like Hearts or Spades, there is a lot of interesting trick-taking games that people could pick up. Like, I think a good starting point there would be something like Diamonds, which people probably haven't heard of, but is, involves a little bit more complexity or a different type of mechanic than people might be used to. I really like Nova Luna. That game, it's more abstract. It only came out a couple of years ago. but it's technically a race game. It's not a physical race, as in people are trying to cross a finish line, but it's the first person to get rid of all of their little tokens wins the game. And for people who I think grew up playing abstract games like chess or checkers, even though it's not played on a similar looking board, it does have that abstract nature where you're just trying to puzzle out what the best thing is to do at any given moment. So that one is a good one as well. But, I'm trying to stay away from the ones that I think are more commonly referred to as gateway games. There are a lot of good, more commonly known ones like Ticket to Ride and Carcassonne and things like that. But those games also can be confusing and not approachable to some people. So I like giving recommendations that kind of fall away from that spectrum.
I think that's a fun thing about the hobby too, is like finding those like off the beaten path games a little bit and like liking them a lot.
Absolutely.
maybe it's just me being like somewhat counterculture in some ways. Like I do love the popular games, but I also really like having the like, I love like the recommendations that I've never heard of. That like, this is like the hidden gems. Like that's what I want to find.
Absolutely. And a lot of the games that I love the most tend to fall into that category. Games that are either hard to find, sometimes now out of print, or just not being talked about as widely. In fact, one of my all-time favorite games, which I will state up front, is less approachable than some of the others I've mentioned. It would be a harder thing to learn if you are new to the hobby. But actually a queer board game designer named Aaron Vanderbeek won the Cardboard Edison Award a few years back. And his game that got published as a result of winning that award, called Castell. The reason I was so drawn to it initially was because of its theme. It is about the Catalonian tradition of building human towers. So in Spain, they do these festivals where they literally build giant towers out of humans and nothing else. No supports. It's big humans on the bottom and tiny babies at the top. And it is fascinating to learn about. And this board game, you're building a team of castellers and traveling around to different festivals and performing. And you actually have cardboard tokens that represent the people on your team. And you physically construct, admittedly laying flat, but like your team of castellers into a tower. And the game is more complex mechanically. It's more mechanisms, I think, than an average like new to the hobby person would probably be comfortable with. But I love it so much. And Aaron's next game actually is going to be hitting Kickstarter like prior to this podcast recording. So, yep. I hope that people get to check that out. I'm super excited about it.
No, I'm excited for it. I did watch a playthrough. I'm like, I think this is a little. I'm trying to think. I think I showed it to my partner, and it was like a little more than I thought he was expecting for that theme. As like a huge Drag Race fan, he was like, what is going on? And I'm like, it's a little more nuanced than I think. It's a little geekier than I think might be anticipated. We'll see how it does. I hope it does well. Like, I'm going to buy it regardless. Like, I need to have it. But I'm like, I don't know if most Drag Race fans will be able to parse through all the mechanics he has in there, but maybe.
I know. It's an interesting thing because truthfully, we do need more board games, more heavier board games with interesting themes, right? Like a lot of the niche themes tend to get put onto lightweight games, and that is good for making those cool themes approachable to new people. But we hobby gamers like really interesting themes too. So honestly, I'm pretty sure Extravaganza was designed with me in mind. So I mean, Aaron did not design it with me in mind, but I'm just like, that's my own in my own head. That it's for me.
Yeah, I think I appreciate that he designed something that he would probably enjoy playing. And that's probably what you should be doing.
Yeah.
So talk to me about, you've mentioned some of the things you've done. Just give me like how you would like title yourself in the industry. Like, what's your role? What do you do? You mentioned a lot of things. So if I can like collect them and give me an overarching, or if there's even more things you do.
Absolutely. So I have been a content creator since 2016. That is when my podcast launched. It's called Board Game Blitz. And what's interesting about the start of the podcast was me and my two co-hosts, Ambi and Cassidy, were all complete strangers who met on Reddit, of all places, in the summer of 2015. Somebody had posted a thread on Reddit saying, what's missing from board game podcasts? Like, what isn't out there? And there were two themes that kept popping up a lot in that thread. And those were, there aren't enough women and there aren't enough short length podcasts. At that point, some of the more popular ones, and even to this day, are things like the Dice Tower or the Secret Cabal, which are great pieces of content, but they were long. And for people who don't have a lot of time to consume podcast content, they weren't as approachable. And me, Ambi, and Cassidy, who had all never talked in any capacity before, all commented within that thread. And we said things like, I think I could do that. And so then we privately messaged the three of us and we said, could we do that? Cassidy was pregnant at the time, so we decided to wait until Cassidy had her baby, because we were like, we're not going to try and launch a Three Strangers podcast while you're pregnant too, because that's too much. So Cassidy had the baby, and the following spring we launched our first episode. Cassidy eventually moved on to other stuff, all good vibes, nothing bad there. And Ambi and I ran on our own with the podcast, and we've now been going, by the time this podcast launches, we will have just celebrated our 6th anniversary. We were the very first board game podcast to be hosted entirely by women. And the fact that we launched in 2016, well after podcasts came around, is, I think, very telling. There have now, since we launched, been lots of podcasts that have come out that have been hosted about board games hosted by women, which is great and wonderful. And that is what we were kind of hoping for. But as I mentioned earlier in the show, that part of the reason we started the show was, we weren't seeing the representation we wanted. And rather than complain about it, we wanted to fix it. In addition to podcasting, we also stream on Twitch. Which a lot of people either aren't familiar with Twitch at all, or they think it's just about video games. And Twitch is still, to this day, very much almost primarily about video games. But there are other types of content that exist on Twitch, music performers and improv groups and board gamers. And we are part of something called the Tabletop Live Network, which is a group of board game Twitch streamers who are dedicated to inclusion and diversity in the board game space. And so we have a large group of streamers who all collaborate once a month to do a 24-hour marathon where we stream in 2-hour chunks, back to back, 12 streamers every month out of our lineup, playing board games on Twitch. And we've been doing that now for about a year and a half. And it has been really, really wonderful because we've gotten to see the community grow. We've gotten to add new people to the lineup and get more eyes on more different types of board game content creators that don't necessarily always get prominent placements in other spaces in media. And that's been really important to us. Our founders, Ruel Gaviola and Nick and Mike Murphy, are wonderful, wonderful humans, and our work, this is not a thing that we all, we do sometimes do sponsored streams, and we have publishers who have come in and sponsored the group as a whole for specific marathons, but it's a labor of love at the end of the day. Nobody's getting rich off board game content on Twitch. But again, for me, it's important. I want to make sure that as a woman and as a queer person, that I am helping promote representation of the things that I identify as in the board game space. We also have a YouTube channel. Ambi, my co-host on the podcast, is the one who makes almost all of the content for our YouTube channel. She is brilliant and wonderful, and she creates a lot of cool stuff. She also has her own YouTube channel, which I want to plug because she's great, where she does board game song parodies. And by the time this podcast releases, I think her newest one will be out. And I don't want to say it, even though it'll probably be out by then. I don't want to spoil it just in case, but it is a work of art. She is so talented, and she has employed the help of a lot of other board game content creators in her next parody. So go to Ambi Rona, AMBIERONA on YouTube, and you will not be disappointed.
So you mentioned kind of your mission, getting into the hobby in the industry. What are you seeing right now? What gives you hope, and what are you hoping to see in the future as you continue to create amazing stuff?
My hope for the future is that it isn't seen as such an anomaly to be a queer person in any space, let alone board games. I have started to see not just about queer representation, but about a lot of marginalized groups. I have started to see people that are not part of those marginalized groups learning how important it is to speak up on behalf of the groups that they're not part of. I will specifically give kudos and props to Rodney Smith of the Watch It Played YouTube channel. Rodney is a really wonderful human and has, to his own, like, he has self-admittedly said that he, for a long time, being a cis white male, did not fully realize or appreciate the burden and the struggles that marginalized groups go through on a daily basis just existing. And I have seen him actively step up and step into situations that he didn't have to come to the defense or to speak out about things that are going on. And I think things like that and people like him are helping turn the tide more than they realize. And I think the more people that realize that adding their voices to that mix will help drown out the few very vocal, awful people that do exist in our hobby, because they have felt empowered. The awful people have felt empowered for a really, really long time because they were met with nothing often, or, people who couldn't speak up or speak out. And they often won't get into it with, people from less marginalized groups such as Rodney, or, there's less damage to be done there. And so I am hopeful that more people will realize that this isn't a fight that should only be fought by the people who are being marginalized. It is about community. Board gaming, if nothing else for me, is about the community, and the entire community needs to take ownership and step up and speak out when they see something happening that isn't okay. And I've seen more and more of that over time, and I'm hopeful that that will continue going forward.
Just so you know, common theme from every guest is, I think everyone wants to advocate for that. Like that's the dream, right?
Yeah.
One of my last questions is, how can people find and follow and support you and experience all the wonderful things that you do?
Well, if people want to find and follow me, probably the best place to do that is Twitter, because my Twitter profile is public and it is just my full name, Crystal Dax. So I'm pretty easy to find there. I will warn you, I tweet a lot. So if you do follow me, if you turn on that notification bell, that's a slippery slope, because I love to tweet. I am an elder millennial. Twitter is my social media of choice at the moment. And I tweet about board games, Star Trek, dogs, the queer community. Trying to think. That's generally the gist of most of the things I tweet about. But I specifically do try and use my platform and my following as a way to lift up other people, especially those who do not have the reach that I do. I really believe that it is important to support new content creators, particularly those from marginalized groups. And so if I see somebody making good content, I don't care if they're already popular or if nobody knows who they are. I try and use that retweet button or that quote tweet button and tell people about the cool things that other people are doing, mostly because I'm selfish and it makes me feel good to do nice things for other people. So totally selfish on my part. But really, I know that the simple act of clicking a retweet button can really make a difference for somebody who is newer to the hobby. And I used to be there, and I had people who were supporting me before I launched even a single episode of my podcast. And I've always tried to pay it forward in that regard. So Twitter is the best place. You can also go to boardgameblitz.com. That will get you links to all of my podcast, Twitch, other related things under the Board Game Blitz umbrella. And if you want to learn more about the Tabletop Live Network, which I am part of, you can go to tabletopLiveNetwork.com and you'll learn more there. And it'll also have our schedule for each of our monthly marathon streams that we do on there. And I'll also introduce you to all of the Tabletop Live Network streamers, which honestly, there's some really good humans in there. So I suggest, my stuff aside, go to the Tabletop Live Network website if y'all are out there and look at what is happening in the board game space on Twitch, because I truly believe that is where there is going to be a lot of growth going forward. I think as publishers and even maybe Twitch itself realizes the value of non-video game content on Twitch, I think things are just going to get bigger and better over there. And so get in on the ground floor. Be one of those people who were like, oh yeah, I was following Board Game Blitz on Twitch years ago, and now they're huge. We're probably not going to be huge, but you know what I mean.
No. And just because I know there's a story behind it, talk to me about the name Crystal Dax. Where does that come from?
Okay, yes. So when I got divorced in 2020, in the state of Nevada where I live, you were legally only allowed to either keep your married name or revert back to your maiden name. And I have no genealogical connection to my maiden name since my dad was adopted as an infant. And I didn't want to keep my married name because, well, I wasn't married anymore and I didn't really need to have a tie to my ex-husband. So I said, well, I have to come up with my own last name. What do I do? I will admit, being a huge Star Trek nerd, a lot of the options on my list were Star Trek related. I will even tell you one of the nerdiest ones that I didn't go with because it was way too out there. Anyone who watches Star Trek will be familiar with a thing that exists in space called the crystalline entity. It is a thing that is in a Star Trek episode. You don't need to know anything about it. It's a giant crystal in space, right? And so my middle name happens to be Anne. And so I was like, what if I was Crystal Anne Entity? I actually kind of considered that for a moment. And then I was like, Entity is a really hard last name to say. That's probably not a smart call. So it went with the character of the name of one of my favorite Star Trek characters of all time, who is Jadzia Dax, who is a Trill. Trills in Star Trek have often kind of been referred to as queer representation in Star Trek before having queer people in Star Trek was really okay, because Trills live multiple lives in multiple bodies and therefore often have attraction to different genders throughout the course of their lives. And so I thought Dax was a pretty cool last name and it fit and felt good. And so I picked it up. And non-Star Trek people just think it's a cool last name, and Star Trek nerds, they know where it came from. And so it has served me well since I adopted it.
Yeah. Chosen names are also a big theme in queer community. You know, whether you're a trans person or a drag queen, big thing.
Absolutely. And also changing your name legally is a pain in the butt. And so when I picked this one, I was like, whatever I pick, I'm sticking with it. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I'm going to tell anyone I meet, this is my last name forever. I'm not changing it again because it's just too much rigmarole.
That is all I have. I'm so grateful that you agreed to do this and you came on and you were your authentic self and were amazing and wonderful. And no one can see it, but always have the best eyeshadow every time I've ever seen you. And then, so as a disclaimer at the end here, I just want to remind everyone that we're just a couple of queer folks. We do not speak for the entire LGBTQI+ community, nor are we trying to. The best way to be an ally is just to keep learning, listening, and remember that we're all trying to figure this out together. So that's all I have. If you're listening, know that you're loved and perfect just the way you are. Until next time.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.